On a warm August night in 1990, a young couple drove down a quiet road outside Houston, Texas, looking for a little privacy. They were laughing, they were happy, they had no idea that someone was already watching them. They never made it home. What was found the next morning was so brutal, so savage, that even seasoned investigators struggled to process what they were seeing. Two young people, full of life just hours before, were gone, and for more than 35 years, the monster responsible walked free, ate dinner, watched television, maybe even drove past that same road again. But here's what that monster didn't count on. Science doesn't forget, and neither do the people who loved Cheryl Henry and Andy Atkinson. This is the story of the Lover's Lane murders, and this is the story of how justice, delayed by decades, finally arrived. Cheryl Henry was the kind of person who lit up a room without even trying. Friends described her as warm, funny, genuinely kind. She had one of those personalities that made everyone around her feel seen. She was building her life in the Houston area, taking it one day at a time, the way young people do when the world still feels full of possibility. Andy Atkinson was cut from similar cloth, hardworking, easygoing, the type of guy who made friends easily and kept them. Those who knew him remember a young man who was loyal to the core, someone who showed up, someone who cared. The two of them had recently started dating. It was new, it was exciting. There's something uniquely electric about the early days of a relationship. Everything feels brighter, conversations last longer than they should, and the world seems to shrink down to just the two of you. That's where Cheryl and Andy were in August of 1990, in that beautiful, fragile beginning. On the night of August 23, 1990, they went out together. Just a normal night, the kind of night you don't think twice about. After their evening out, they did what couples do. They found a quiet spot outside of Houston, a stretch of road that locals knew well, a place people went for privacy, away from the noise of the world. Lover's Lane. That's what people called it, the way they call such places in every town, in every state, in every part of this country. They parked, they talked, maybe they laughed, maybe they made plans for the following weekend. And then something unspeakable happened. The details of what was discovered the following morning are the kind that sink into you and stay. Cheryl and Andy were found dead. The violence that had been done to them was extreme. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't some impulsive, momentary act. Whoever did this came with intent, came with purpose, came knowing exactly what they wanted to do, and did it without hesitation. The Harris County community was shaken to its foundation. Here were two young people, in a relationship barely off the ground, cut down in the most horrifying way imaginable. Parents locked their doors. Couples stopped parking in quiet spots. The name Lover's Lane took on a new and sinister meaning. Law enforcement moved quickly, the way they always do in those first frantic hours after a violent crime. They processed the scene, they canvassed the area, they knocked on doors, pulled records, followed every thread they could find. Detectives interviewed anyone who might have seen something, heard something, knew something, but every trail went cold. Think about that for a moment. Two people murdered in a public area well known enough to have a nickname, and somehow, the killer slipped away. No arrest, no indictment, no answers for the families who were left behind to grieve without closure. The case went into a file, the file went into a cabinet, and the years began to pass. 1 year, then 5, then 10. The families of Cheryl Henry and Andy Atkinson didn't stop hurting. Grief doesn't work that way. It doesn't follow a timeline, doesn't check a calendar, doesn't fade just because the rest of the world has moved on. For those families, August 23, 1990 was a wound that never fully closed. Every birthday, every holiday, every quiet Tuesday afternoon when a memory comes rushing back without warning. That's what unsolved cases do to the people left behind. They trap them. They hold them suspended in a moment of horror that never officially ends because there is never an answer. Detectives who worked the case carried it with them too. There are cases that stay with investigators long after they move on to other files, other crimes, other years. The Lover's Lane murders were that kind of case, the kind you turn over in your mind at 2 in the morning, the kind where you wonder what you missed, what evidence didn't exist yet, what technology hadn't been invented that might have changed everything. And here's the thing about that last thought: it wasn't wrong. 20 years into the new millennium, forensic science had become something those 1990 investigators could never have imagined. The mapping of the human genome had opened doors that were once sealed shut. DNA analysis had evolved from a rough sketch into a razor-sharp portrait, and a company called Othram, a forensic genomics laboratory based in the Woodlands, Texas, of all places, had developed capabilities that were quietly revolutionizing cold case investigations across the country. Othram specialized in something called forensic-grade genome sequencing. In plain language, what that means is this: they could take trace biological evidence so small, so degraded, so compromised by time that traditional DNA testing couldn't do anything useful with it, and extract a genetic profile powerful enough to search genealogical databases, powerful enough to build a family tree, powerful enough in some cases to find a killer. Law enforcement agencies began bringing their coldest, most stubborn cases to Othram, cases from the 70s, cases from the 80s, cases that had sat untouched for so long that the original detectives had retired, had grown old, in some cases had died. And Othram, with its extraordinary technology and its team of scientists, began working miracles. The Cheryl, Henry, and Andy Atkinson case came back into the light. Evidence that had been collected back in 1990, evidence preserved with the diligence of investigators who never stopped hoping it might one day matter, was submitted to Othram for analysis, and the scientists there did what they do. They sequenced, they searched, they began building a picture from fragments that had sat dormant for over 3 decades. What happened next shocked everyone who had been waiting for answers. A suspect emerged, a name, a real, identifiable human being, someone who had been living their life all this time, 35 years of waking up in the morning and going to bed at night, while Cheryl, Henry, and Andy Atkinson's families lived in darkness. The genealogical work, combined with traditional investigative follow-up, led law enforcement to a person of interest. Evidence was developed. The case that had seemed permanently frozen began to move. An arrest was made. Let that land for a second. After more than 35 years, after decades of silence and grief and unanswered questions, after Cheryl's family had mourned without justice, after Andy's family had carried the weight of an open wound for over a generation, after every investigator who ever touched this file wondered if they would ever see it resolved, an arrest was made. The monster of Lover's Lane had a face, had a name, had been caught. Now let's talk about what this case represents, because it is so much bigger than one arrest. This is a story about persistence, about the refusal to accept that some crimes will simply go unpunished, about the families who never gave up hope and the investigators who never let the file gather so much dust that it couldn't be opened again. And yes, it is about technology, about the stunning, almost unbelievable advances in forensic science that have turned the tables on killers who thought they were safe, who thought time was their ally. Because here's what those killers never understood: time doesn't erase evidence, not entirely, not anymore, not with what science can now do with a microscopic trace of biological material that has been waiting patiently in an evidence bag for 35 years. The genome doesn't lie, it doesn't forget. It is, in its own way, the most faithful witness that ever existed. Othram's work on cold cases across the United States has become one of the most remarkable stories in modern criminal justice. They have helped solve murders from the 1970s. They have given names to unidentified victims. They have put handcuffs on people who had been sleeping soundly for decades, absolutely certain they had gotten away with it. The Lovers Lane murders are now part of that legacy, part of that growing list of cases that prove beyond any doubt that the arc of justice is long, but it does bend. And now we have to reckon with a darker possibility, because in cases like this, when a killer has operated for years without consequence, investigators often ask themselves a chilling question: was this the first time, or were there others? The phrasing around this case has included those two terrible words: maybe more. Two confirmed victims, maybe more. It is the kind of phrase that opens a door into darkness. It suggests that investigators are not certain this story ends with Cheryl and Andy. It suggests that there may be other families, in other places, still waiting for answers without knowing that their answers might be connected to the monster of Lovers Lane. This is the reality of predatory violence. It rarely exists in isolation. People who are capable of what was done to Cheryl Henry and Andy Atkinson on that August night in 1990 do not simply spring into existence for one act and then disappear back into normalcy. They have histories, they have patterns, and when those patterns span decades and geography, the work of investigators becomes not just about bringing justice for the known victims, but about illuminating every dark corner the suspect may have traveled through. Law enforcement, armed with the genetic evidence that led to this arrest, will now dig. They will look at other cold cases, other unsolved disappearances, other crimes from that era and that region that might share a signature, a method, a thread. Because the capture of a suspect is not the end of an investigation. Sometimes it is the beginning of a much larger one. For the families of Cheryl Henry and Andy Atkinson, the arrest is a moment of profound and complicated emotion. 35 years is a long time to wait. The people who loved them have aged. Some may have passed without ever knowing this day would come. Those who are still here have carried this for so long that it has become part of the architecture of their lives, built into every year, every holiday, every quiet moment of memory. And then, one day, the phone rings, or there's a knock at the door, and someone from law enforcement tells you that they have a suspect, that the person who took your loved one from you in the most violent and senseless way imaginable has been found, that there will be a day in court, that there will be an accounting. What does that feel like? It isn't simple happiness. It isn't clean relief. It is something far more layered and human than that. It is grief and gratitude tangled together. It is the reopening of a wound that has been healing imperfectly for decades. It is the return of a name to the headlines, a name that belongs to a real person, a person who deserved so much more than what they got. Cheryl Henry deserved more. She deserved to grow older, to build more friendships, to find out how her story continued. Andy Atkinson deserved more. He deserved to keep showing up for the people who loved him, to see what kind of man the years would make him. They deserved ordinary things, the extraordinary, mundane, precious, ordinary things that most of us take completely for granted, because why wouldn't we when we assume we'll have a lifetime of them? They were robbed of all of it. On a warm August night, by someone who decided that their lives were his to take. Someone who drove away and ate breakfast the next morning while two families shattered. Someone who, by all available evidence, continued on, continued living, maybe continued harming, while the rest of the world slowly stopped asking questions. But the questions never fully stopped. That's the thing. That's always the thing in cases like this. There are always people who keep asking. The family members who call the tip lines year after year. The detectives who pull the old file on a slow afternoon and read through it one more time. The journalists and podcasters and advocates who keep saying the names. Cheryl Henry, Andy Atkinson. Say the names. Keep saying them. Don't let them become statistics. Don't let them become just another entry in an unsolved case database. Because the moment we stop saying the names is the moment we risk letting the killers win, and they haven't won here. After 35 years, they have not won. This case is part of a revolution that is quietly transforming the American criminal justice system. There are thousands of cold cases in evidence vaults across this country, evidence collected by investigators who did everything right, preserved by departments that never stopped hoping it would matter someday. And now, with genetic genealogy and companies like Othram and the courage of law enforcement agencies willing to try new approaches, those cases are being cracked open. Killers who were certain they were invisible are being found. Families who had accepted that they would never know the truth are getting phone calls they thought would never come. That is extraordinary. That is one of the genuinely extraordinary things happening in our world right now, even when the world often feels like it offers very little to celebrate. For everyone listening to this story, for everyone who knew Cheryl and Andy, who loved them, who has been carrying this grief, this moment matters. This arrest matters. Not because it brings back what was lost. Nothing can do that. Not because it erases 35 years of pain. It cannot. But because it means that somewhere, in a courtroom, the evidence will be presented. The facts will be laid bare. The system will do what it is supposed to do, and a person who committed an unspeakable act of violence will be held accountable. The monster of Lover's Lane has been caught. That doesn't make the world whole again. It doesn't undo August 23, 1990. It doesn't return to Cheryl and Andy a single moment of the lives they were supposed to have. But it means something. It means that the darkness has a limit. It means that the people we lose to violence are not forgotten. It means that science and persistence and the refusal to give up can, against all odds, outlast even the coldest of cold cases. There will be more to this story. There will be court dates and evidence hearings and the slow, grinding machinery of justice doing its work. There may be revelations about other victims, other crimes, other chapters in a story that stretches back into the last century. And when those developments come, we will be here to follow them. But tonight, in this moment, let's sit for just a second with what has been achieved. Let's acknowledge the investigators who kept this case alive, the scientists at Othram who built something impossible with something impossibly small, the families who never stopped asking the question. And most of all, let's say the names. Cheryl Henry, Andy Atkinson. They were real people. They were loved. And after 35 years, the world finally knows who took them. That is not nothing. After all this time, that is everything.